pleasure to once again welcome you to the 68th Bernard Price Memorial Lecture, which the University of Witwatersrand takes pride in hosting, and I've been led to believe has done so for many years. I only hosted 4 or 5 since I joined the university as the Deputy Vice Chancellor, and indeed it is one of the highlights of the academic year for us to be given the honor, President Debo, to host this auspicious lecture. More in particular, because I'm speaking here as a physicist, that I'm grateful to some of the pioneers that were ahead in the 1960s, who actually invented or co-invented the Ethernet, like Professor Metcalfe. When I was a student, as a young CERN scientist in the 1990s, in Geneva, CERN, I remember downloading my first scientific article in 1995 on a mosaic spreadsheet through the SAIEE, NCSA in Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Little did I know that, on top of the work that Tim Berners-Lee had done, but they were pioneers who had laid the great foundation. And I think it's my pleasure to meet one today. So I'm really delightful to have you here, and I look forward to an excellent lecture, and I welcome you to WITS once again.
Ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Professor Zeblon Vilakazi for your kind words of welcome and introduction. Once again, the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers and myself as President for the current year appreciate the partnership that is offered by the University of Witwatersrand in jointly hosting this event. I would like to take this opportunity of welcoming the members and guests of the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers, of welcoming members of council and office bearers, and members of the Institute's administrative staff, including our CEO, Sekelo Zulu, and our operations manager, Nancy Matutalu, and their associated spouses. I'd also like to take this opportunity of extending a special word of welcome to the staff and students of the University of the University's Department of Electrical and Information Engineering, and to thank them for the very interesting and informative tour that we took of their laboratories earlier today. It may be worthwhile at this point in time to take a look at how the Bernard Price Memorial Lecture came about and to see how it's progressed over the years. The detail around the history of the Bernard Price Lecture is contained within the program that has been handed out. The lecture started as a joint meeting between the university and the institute, which started in 1931, which actually, in actual fact, was the year in which the centenary of the discovery of electromagnetic induction by Michael Faraday was actually commemorated. In 1951, which aligned with the 21st joint meeting between the institute and the university, it was decided by council to rename this joint meeting the Bernard Price, or to rename this joint meeting in the name of Dr. Bernard Price, who was not only instrumental in a number of major electrical engineering accomplishments at that time, which included the starting of the Victoria Falls and Transvaal Power Company, which is a forerunner to the Eskom of today, but it was also a significant benefactor to the University of the Witwatersrand. Dr. Price died in 1948, and his family, which comprises some electrical engineers, still remain on close terms with the Institute. Over the years, the Bernard Price Memorial Lecture has been presented by many prominent lecturers and engineers and scientists, and a full list is included in the program that was handed out this evening. Those of you who attended the AGM earlier this year would be aware of the fact that my theme for the year is digital transformation. In particular, I have an interest in digital transformation in order to provide individuals who, because of economic circumstances as well as location, do not have access to physical delivery of services such as healthcare, education, and access to job opportunities, as well as financial services. I therefore see digital transformation as offering inclusivity to these individuals. One of the foundation requirements to implement a digital transformation strategy or program is to have connectivity. And that is the topic for tonight's lecture, which will be presented by Professor Robert Metcalfe. If I had to present Bob Metcalfe's curriculum vitae in detail, we'd actual fact have no time for the evening's presentation, taking into account his age, as well as his significant accomplishments. You do have a detailed CV in the program, so let me instead highlight some of the achievements and also concentrate on some of the aspects which are not generally conveyed in official CVs that you'll find for Bob. Obviously, we know Bob as one of the co-inventors of Ethernet, which he achieved together with David Boggs at Xerox PARC in 1973. We also know Bob as one of the co-founders of 3Com, which he founded in 1979 together with Howard Charney, and he left 3Com in 1990. 3Com was acquired in 2010 by Hewlett Packard. We also know Bob as the creator of Metcalfe's law, which basically says that the effectiveness of a network is proportional or equivalent to the square of the number of nodes that make up that network, which I understand, and I think Bob will elaborate on this a bit more during his presentation, was actually started out as a marketing campaign. It was actually a tool which was used by 3Com in order to get customers to buy Ethernet ports. After leaving 3Com, Bob entered the world of publishing and became a pundit, writing an internet column for InfoWorld, in which he showed both the good and the bad of what was happening within the computer and telecommunications industry in the United States. During this period, he published 2 books. The first was in 1996 with the title Packet Communications. It was a technical book. He co-authored this with David Walden. And in 2010, he published his second book. In 2000, he published his second book, which was called Internet Collapses and Other InfoWorld Punditry, in which he addressed a number of topics, some of which were controversial at the time, and included things like Microsoft's predatory business practices, the future of wireless, and also discussion on open source, on the open source movement, and so on. Bob received a number of reviews for this book, and I'd like to end off this introduction by quoting the review from Vince Cerf. And we all know Vince, he was our Bernard Price Memorial Lecturer a few years ago. And Vince Cerf said the following. He said, "You may not like the way he phrases it, but he's actually got some very important things to say, and he isn't afraid to say them." Bob, we are looking forward to your presentation on connectivity. Please join us on stage.
Good evening and thank you. The most important new fact about the human condition is that we are now suddenly connected. I guess you could dispute this. You might say connectivity isn't the most important thing, or you might say it didn't happen so suddenly. And I'd like to talk about both of those aspects. The internet is 50 years old this year, and I've been going to all the parties because, as you know, success has many fathers, and everyone has a party. And the next one is on October 29th. The World Wide Web turns 30 this year, and already 4.39 billion people use the internet. That's up 9% from last year, and it's already 57% of us. And already we're not alone on the internet. There are more things on the internet than there are now people. And I would argue, just this one time, that this rush of connectivity has brought freedom and prosperity. That is, if you look at this chart of the growth of the internet, which is blurred in the background here, you'll notice that you will notice with study that it overlaps this chart. That is, the more connectivity we've enjoyed suddenly over the last 50 years, the more poverty has declined rapidly. My good fortune to have been born around then, and the transistor was about this big. And of course, it's now quite a bit smaller. You have billions of them in your pocket. I don't know whether, I'm willing to bet that if you are old enough, you've had this experience. Where my mom said, when you get where you're going, give us a call so we know you're safe. Let it ring 3 times and then hang up. My mom loved me, but not that much. That's how expensive the telephone was in those days, in the 60s. It was so expensive that your mother wouldn't want to talk to you on it because she couldn't afford it. And in this picture, there's missing information. You notice there's no wire leading from the telephone to somewhere else. They left that out of the picture. And the other thing that's not shown in this picture is that when the telephone monopoly in the United States was established, the telephone looked approximately like the picture on the left. And when the monopoly was disrupted in the 1980s, the telephone looked approximately like the picture on the right. And speaking of wires, so in that period, after calling my mom, I was asked to build this device, a connectivity device, whose purpose was to connect MIT, one of MIT's computers, to a thing called the Arpanet, which I think of as Internet 1.0. Took me a year to build this, to connect the Arpanet packet switch. I got number 6. I had the 6th packet switch, and connecting it through a bunch of cables to a PDP-10 computer, thereby beginning my career in improving connectivity beyond this black telephone. And I did such a good job building that I got to go there. So I left MIT in 1972 and joined Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which I refer to here as the time machine. So it was at Xerox Research that we got to suspend all the constraints of the present and build something out into the future. So this was my time machine, and at Xerox PARC, we began building the internet. We built an internet just for Xerox, connecting all of Xerox's many offices with printers and personal computers and so on. So I had the benefit of this time machine going out a decade. And so this is what the internet looked like, and it was called the Arpanet then in 1973. And the yellow parts on this slide are the 2 places that I put MIT in the upper right, put that on the internet, and then I put Xerox in the upper left, put that on the internet. And this was the internet. Let's call it the kilobit internet, because the trunk lines that connected the 2 coasts of the United States each ran at 50 kilobits per second. The trunk lines of the internet were at 50 kilobits per second. Now you'll notice on the left, one of those circuits went out to the University of Hawaii, so it went under the ocean for 2,500 miles. And you'll notice on the right, the internet actually by this time had reached Oslo, and was and through Oslo ended up in London. And as the internet now began its international expansion. This is a group, IFIP, the International Federation for Information Processing Technical Committee number 6, began meeting around then in the late 70s. And that was caused from my previous trip to South Africa. Because what this group did was to meet around the world, promoting the use of the internet and having a 1-day seminar associated with each of those visits. And so I don't remember the South African representative, but we met here in Johannesburg in the late 1970s to promote the use of the packet switching internet. In this picture, you'll see I'm in the middle, in the back, being so humble and self-effacing, I stood in the back. But we have the inventor of packet switching, we have the French representative, we have the Russian. He and I didn't get along so well. The Canadians, Indians. Asia is not well represented in this picture, nor are women. Apparently women didn't attend meetings in those days. So here it is now, roughly 1972. I moved to the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. You see here the picture of sort of a hunched over paranoid grad student. I've just had my PhD thesis oral defense rejected by Harvard University. That explains part of the hunched over part. But in this, it took me a year to overcome Harvard's objections. But let me show you what's in my office in 1972. On the far right, you see a Texas Instruments Silent 700 that ran at 30 characters per second. It had an RS-232 cable about this thick that carried 300 bits per second between my terminal and the mini computer in the back room. At the top shelf toward the back is a box of 35mm slides. We didn't have PowerPoint. I was on the board of a company that developed PowerPoint, and we sold it to Microsoft for $14 million in 1987. This is 1972. So in those days, you made your own 35mm slides with a camera, and then you put them in a carousel and you projected them. You'll see right by my left arm a thing called a Rolodex. That's an actual Rolodex. And then next to it is what you may recognize as a telephone. And to the left of that, a few pencils. And on the lower right is, I had to insert it because it didn't make this picture, is a picture of an IBM Selectric typewriter, the device upon which I typed the memo inventing Ethernet. So in 1973 or so, the Xerox Research Center decided to take a big risk, go 10 years out into the future, and put a computer on every desk. This is a picture of that computer. A computer on every desk. Why would you want to do that? Where would you put the printer? Where would you put the disks? How would you maintain it? How would it be cooled? Would it make so much noise? You'd have to maintain it, la 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 la. But we decided to go ahead anyway and put a computer on every desk. Guess who lucked out? They needed somebody, we needed somebody to do a network to connect these personal computers, and I got the job. That was one of the biggest strokes of luck in my life. And so we began work on devising a network worthy of these desktop personal computers. So connect a computer on every desk, where we have to see to the transmission of data among them, the multiplexing of information, and the switching of the information to its destination. So we began the design, and let me just touch on 3 of the technologies that we adopted to include in the original Ethernet in 1973. I'll talk a little bit about the cabling. This is a meeting of electrical engineers, isn't it? So it's okay if I talk about, I'm not allowed to talk about this in polite company here. So I'm going to talk about the cabling and what the novel approach we took to cabling. I'm going to talk about clocking and the old-fashioned clocking method we used. And I'm going to talk about access to the shared medium, the Gerald Tapp, the Manchester encoding, and the Aloha network randomized retransmissions. So I'm going to talk about those 3, 1 slide each. But in approaching this design, we had a constraint. And this constraint was whatever we did, whatever network we designed, it had to fit on that card. And that card had room for 80 14-pin dual inline packages, 40 chips. So my partner in crime, David Boggs, and I began to design, keeping in mind that whatever we did had to fit. And it had to fit on these chips that were, if you You'll see on the left side, I've listed the platform. These were Texas Instruments SN7400 TTL 14-pin dip chips. They had a 10 nanosecond gate delay, so that was something of a constraint on speed. And the big enabling technology in those days was memory chips, Intel 1103, the first important memory, semiconductor memory chips. They had 1,000 bits per chip. And each of these chips cost on the order of $20. So this is the engineering constraint. Whatever you do, guys, you gotta fit it on this card. And one of the things we had to fit on the card was the clock. That is, we were gonna be sending packets a bit at a time, and we had to clock them off the card one bit at a time. So we needed a clock. And David and I looked at this card and we could not find a place to put the clock. But we did notice that the back plane of the personal computer had a clock, the system clock. It ticked every 170 nanoseconds. So in order to fit Ethernet on the card, we adopted that clock as our packet clock. And I'll touch on this in a second, but since each bit was going to take 2 clocks, that meant that the bits were going to be 340 nanoseconds wide, 340 feet wide, because of the ticking of this clock. So the speed of the internet, of this first Ethernet, would be 2.94 megabits per second. And why that speed? Because that was the clock that we could get off the back plane of the PC and was not on this card. So the 2.94 megabits per second is not a magic number. It's the speed of the clock, determined by the speed of the system clock of this personal computer. There was not a requirements document written that said we needed 2.94 megabits per second. We just went as fast as we could and still fit on this card. But we also had a simplifying principle, the architecture of the internet. I guess some of you may remember the Open Systems Interconnection 7 levels as established by the International Standards Organization, and here's a picture of it. And what this 7 layers allowed us to do was not do a lot of things. That is, all we had to do was handle the bottom 2 layers, data link and physical, assuming that the higher protocols would take care of everything else. So this was a grand simplification. So for example, Ethernet doesn't have acknowledgements in it. We just needed to carry packets, and the higher level protocols would take care to keep track of which packets were being lost and which ones had to be retransmitted and which ACKs had to be sent. So that card did not need to have acknowledgements on it. So this was our grand simplification. We only did what we had to at the lowest levels. So here was our first decision. We were living in a building that had cables running to a wiring closet, and it looked like a rat's nest. So we said, let's use as few wires as possible. In fact, let's use 1 wire. A yellow cable, 1/2 inch thick, that we would run down the center of the corridor. And everywhere there was a PC that needed to be connected, we would run a cable up to it and we would tap into that cable that went by. And we achieved 2 things with this approach. One is it was 1 wire cable, a coax, instead of 1 for each of the PCs. And 2 is you didn't have to bring the network down in order to install a new PC. You didn't cut the coax, you punctured it with this vampire tap. So that was one of the first decisions we made about what Ethernet would look like. To reduce the number of cables and to allow 24/7 operation, we decided to use a shared coaxial cable at 2.94 megabits per second. Then we had to decide how to put the bits on this cable, and we decided to do it with big transistors, open collector transistors. So when turned on, they would yank the cable up to 3.3 believe it was 3.5 volts. And then when turned off, they would let go of the cable. So on and off. Yank it up to 3.5 volts or just leave it alone. And then we decided to use Manchester encoding. So as the Manchester encoding would determine whether that transistor was turned off or not. So on the top line here, you see the clicking of the clock. So each bit was under Manchester encoding, each bit had two halves. The bit and the complement of the bit and bit bar. And that guaranteed that in the middle of every bit cell there was a transition. It's either an up to down transition or a down to up transition in the middle of each bit cell. So we could recover the clock from that transition. And since this Manchester encoding guaranteed that the cable would be off half the time. On, off, bit, bar, clicking by. So this was our second and perhaps the most important decision, was to choose the on-off driving of this coax. So when you put a voltage on it, that voltage would propagate at approximately 0.7 times the speed of light to the two ends of the coax and be available to anybody on that cable to see. And the third technology we chose had to do with how stations would take turns using this cable. We had a shared cable. Various attached machines would have packets to send now and then, but how would they take turns? So we exploited the Manchester encoding, and a great idea we picked up from the University of Hawaii. It was called randomized retransmissions. You would send a packet. If it didn't get through, you generate a random number and try again some random time later. So we took that simple idea, randomized retransmissions, as a way of taking turns on the cable, and we made it into a LAN. The Aloha network wasn't a LAN, it was a terminal wide area network. We chose to make Ethernet distributed. The Aloha network had a central packet switch. Ethernet had just the cable, there was no packet switch. We made it 1,000 times faster because we didn't have to build a radio. We could use the coax and those hefty transistors. And anytime you wanted to send a packet, you could look at the cable and tell within a bit time or two whether somebody else was already using it because of the way Manchester worked. If you were sending a packet, you'd be wiggling that cable. And anyone else wanting to send a packet could listen and say, oh, there's somebody already sending, I'll wait. So that's called carrier sense. Aloha network didn't have that. And not only that, if you happen to be transmitting and you notice that somebody else was turning the cable on when you expected it to be off, that meant somebody else was interfering with your transmission. That would be called a collision. And Ethernet had collision detection in it thanks to Manchester encoding. And so we were able to stop transmitting whenever collisions occur, thereby limiting their damage. And then finally, we put a control mechanism in, is that if there were too many retransmissions, that meant the cable was very busy. We would back off. We would try the whole method, deep control theory here. If the network gets busy, you don't try harder to get traffic through. You back off and try less hard and thereby optimize the throughput of the channel. So those were the three technologies that three of the technologies we adopted to design Ethernet. So this is a hand-drawn diagram from 1973. I drew this showing how Ethernet would work. You see the yellow cable with the devices tapping into it, sending packets up and down that cable. The packets contained an 8-bit address. So if your 8-bit address came by, you would copy the packet off the cable. And if it was somebody else's packet, you just let it go by and not pay attention to it. At the far right of this diagram, you'll see the word radio ether. This is the place where I annoy 100 people who invented Wi-Fi by showing them that Wi-Fi had been invented in 1973 on this diagram. It's called radio ether. One of my hobbies, since I'm from New York, is annoying people. Now, speaking of annoying people, the guy who designed this Alto personal computer, Chuck Thacker, recipient of the ACM Turing Award, he designed this machine, and I don't know why, but he and I didn't get along. So David and I built this Ethernet card, and Chuck we didn't get along. He made Ethernet an option. So he made this little piece of paper with check boxes. So you could, if you were a research scientist at Xerox and you wanted one of these PCs, you'd check how much memory you wanted, half or full, whether you wanted a printer, a bunch of things. And one of them was a little box checking, I want an Ethernet card for my PC. That is, Ethernet was an option. And this was Chuck's way of sort of needling, since we didn't get along, needling me. But then Chuck did something. He himself wrote a diagnostic that ran in the Alto and tested the semiconductor memories. Semiconductor memories were new then. And the way this machine worked is you could test the memory and see if it was about to start failing. And if it did, you could send a technician in to repair the machine. And Chuck developed this trivial diagnostic, and then he realized that to really make it useful, it needed to run on all the machines. And the data needed to be sent back to his technician's station. So Ethernet would have to be on all of the machines. So much to his chagrin, shortly after the arrival of Ethernet, it was no longer an option. So I call this the first act of Ethernet, was to connect these semiconductor memory diagnostics. Annoying Chuck. The second act was perhaps more robust. We built the world's first laser printer, whose name was EARS. EARS is a two-dimensional acronym. Ethernet, Alto, RCG, Slot. And RCG stood for Research Character Generator, done by Ron Ryder. And SLOT stood for the Scanning Laser Output Terminal. So this was a page per second laser printer, 500 dots per inch, 8.5 by 11, one page every second. If you do the math, that's a 23 megabit per second peak data rate. Now, of course, we never used peak, but this printer, in order to keep it busy, you couldn't use an RS-232 terminal because it would just sit there idle most of the time. So one of the benefits of Ethernet, and that was how you access this printer, was to use Ethernet. So I wrote the time sharing system for this little printer and put the Ethernet file transfer protocol in it. So the only way that you could print a beautiful document was to use the Ethernet to print on this printer. So that made sure everybody was an Ethernet user because they wanted to print on this printer. And the third app was the Internet's initial killer app. The Internet was built to provide what was called resource sharing, remote login to time sharing systems around the world. So the Telnet protocol was the protocol developed for the Arpanet so that dumb terminals could log into remote time sharing systems. So I wrote a Telnet protocol, one of them, which you actually used a dumb terminal on your time sharing system to access a remote terminal. Let me skip this part. And then I wrote another version of the Telnet that ran on the Alto PC. So that was not a dumb terminal, but a PC connecting to remote machines. So the Telnet was the proposed killer app of the Internet. And that lasted about a year. It took a year for email to become the killer app of the Internet. So we did the Telnet. Then we needed to do file transfer protocol to get your data there so that your program could run. And then someone figured out how to use FTP to send emails around among the attached computers. And the next thing you know, we had an email internet. So what were the principal innovations of the CSMA-CD Ethernet at Xerox PARC? None of them were the three I mentioned. The Gerald Tap lasted for 10 years. The Manchester encoding lasted until we went to 100 megabits per second and we couldn't use Manchester encoding anymore. And the Aloha packet retransmission scheme was obsoleted by the availability of Ethernet hubs with cheap memory. So instead, these are the three principal innovations, connectivity innovations delivered by Ethernet. The first was bringing packets to the desktop. Prior to Ethernet, there were dumb terminals on the desktop that were laboriously connected to a time-sharing system, which then connected them to the network. With Ethernet, we brought the packets, the internet's packets, all the way to the desktop. Second, we introduced abundant bandwidth. I mentioned I had a Texas Instruments Silent 700 on my desk that was served by cables carrying 300 bits per second. We call them 300 baud. The next day, we had an Ethernet port there running at 2.94 megabits per second. So let's see, 2.94 megabits compared to 300. Is that a 10% speed up? Is that a doubling of the speed up? Is that 100 times speed up? Is it 1,000 times speed up? Oh no, we sped up the bandwidth on the desk by a factor of 10,000, which is a really big factor. This would later make it practical to upload cat pictures on Facebook. The third innovation introduced by Ethernet was joining the effort to have international standards for the interconnection of computers. So there was the Telnet protocol, the file transfer protocol, TCP/IP, and Ethernet were all part of a standards package that we delivered to the world to build the internet. And then later, the World Wide Web added HTML, HTTP, and URL. So all of that is the basic standards package, and Ethernet was part of joining that movement away from having each vendor having their own communication protocol. This was now a standard set of protocols providing the internet. So the picture on the left is the rat's nest that we set out to eliminate. And we eliminated it for about 20 years. With the center, you notice instead of a lot of wires, there's just one big shared cable. And that lasted about 20 years. The right-hand picture is the way we are today. We now have hubs and switches and routers, and we have a mess, just like we had before. Fortunately, Wi-Fi and 5G are coming to solve that problem. So sometimes technologies come and go, and it's not because they were a mistake, it's that they were applicable at one point in time and then lost their applicability. The principal change over this period of time was the cost of memory. The hubs and the routers and the switches became economical as the cost of memory plunged. So with this all beginning to hum, it was time to scale the internet. And a number of startups were formed for that purpose, including my own 3Com. So here's me and my investor and my adult supervision preparing to fill the world with Ethernet cards. Now, one of the things we did to sell Ethernet cards is we sold a 3-node trial network, a diskette with software on it, and then 3 of our cards that allow you to plug your PC, an IBM PC, into the shared cable. And we sold these for $3,000. And our customers came back and said, it does exactly what you said it could do. It's just not useful. So the 3 things you could do with this trial package is you could share a disk among any of the 3 machines. You put one disk on one of the machines and the other 2 machines could share it. Or you could put a $7,000 Apple LaserWriter on one of the PCs and share it from the other 2. Or an email user on any one of the 3 machines could send an email to either of the other 2 machines. And that proved not to be useful. And And at the time, I was the VP of Sales and Marketing of my company, and decided that was a problem. So I came up with this slide. And this slide basically said that the value of a network was related to the number of possible connections you could make, and that grew as n squared, the number of nodes squared. And so, customers, the reason your networks are not useful is that they're not big enough. And so the remedy for that is to buy more of our products, which they did. And this promise worked out. Remember I mentioned that I had been in a time machine at Xerox PARC. I knew from having lived in an internet world inside of Xerox PARC 10 years in the future, I knew that if people connected their machines together, they would find value in it. So when I made this slide, I was not lying. Here's David Boggs with me, and he's holding the first Ethernet card, that 80-chip card that he and I built. And then, and the transceiver is beneath it. And then to his right is the 500,000th Ethernet card that my company, 3Com, built. And this is part of the scaling up of the internet infrastructure, eventually 3Com would ship millions of these cards per month and spread Ethernet to the whole world. Now there were so let's think of Ethernet as a silver bullet that enabled the internet. There were other silver bullets, and I have to mention this one because it made a huge difference. And I had nothing to do with this one, but it's a kind of connectivity. In the 1990s, wave division multiplexing became practical. And by that, they mean putting multiple streams of data down a single optical fiber by using a different color for each channel. And eventually you could put 80 or 160 different colors on a fiber, these tiny little fibers, and send data at gigabits per second. This is the technology that made it possible for me to speak to my mother, because it made telephone connections free. That's the diagram on the bottom left. After the introduction of dense wave division multiplexing, the cost of that call to my mom went to zero. And a funny thing happened, which is called the Negroponte switch. Everything that had been wireless up until then became wired, like TV. And everything that was wired became wireless, like telephones. And that's called the Negroponte switch, enabled, I believe, by the silver bullet of the internet, the wave division multiplexing. So this plumbing, Ethernet is plumbing for the internet, and it was deployed, and then magic happened. People started taking this platform, this 7-level platform, and developing new unexpected applications. Like our physicists at CERN, Tim Berners-Lee, came up with a thing called the World Wide Web in 1989. It kicked in at scale in 1994 when a company called Netscape went public with its World Wide Web browser. There's an amazing thing to note about that the World Wide Web was put on top of TCP/IP and Ethernet. Plumbing that had been invented in '73, and this was in '89. So that plumbing endured that whole time, and the World Wide Web worked on top of it. That's amazing. Of course, then web publishing gave rise to search, because suddenly there were too many places to do it by hand, so you needed a company like Google to search the net for you. And that also led, by reducing the frictions of connectivity, to commerce, a company called Amazon. And then came social, Facebook and Twitter. And those apps began disrupting the fundamental connectivity industries. It was a time when the phrase voice, video, and data was common terminology. Yes, voice, video, and data. There were separate industries. The voice industry did telephone, the video industry did television, and the data industry did computers. And the internet completely erased those distinctions. That is, those three major industries converged. In fact, the word convergence was the term we used while it was happening. And now we're on the verge of the next big disruptions. I mean, we've disrupted journalism, we've disrupted advertising, but now we're going to disrupt education, energy, and health, and those are big ones. These are much bigger than the industries that the internet has disrupted before. And by the way, when I say disruptive, I'm using it in the positive sense rather than the pejorative. So in education, bricks and mortar education is giving way to internet learning. And so the University of Texas continues to build new buildings, but we need to be careful because pretty soon we've begun offering degrees where the students don't even have to show up on campus at any time. Energy is becoming distributed on an internet model, and healthcare is about to be health, not healthcare. The goal isn't healthcare, the goal is health, and that's about to be disrupted by internet technologies. Just another example of disruption. I was looking the other day at the Internet of Things and how it's coming along, and there it was, automotive Ethernet. So now the IEEE is standardizing a version of Ethernet to be used inside of cars as they become electric and driverless and more automated. Now with these disruptive benefits, let me call them benefits of connectivity, are some pathologies. And this is where the suddenness of the internet comes in. The internet came suddenly upon us in 50 years, delivering connectivity that we did not fully understand how to deal with. So initially we had porn. Porn is always first. Followed right by spam, which is probably worse. And then polarization, and you can make your own list. Polarization of communities because of this connectivity, allowing us to find other people who think like us and polarizing us. Radicalization, addiction. I used Twitter for 10 years. I tweeted 35,000 times. I had 25,000 followers, and I stopped a couple of months ago. I went cold turkey because I realized that I had become addicted. Actually, what happened is Apple came out with a new feature that told you how many hours per day you were using various apps. And it said I was using Twitter 3.5 hours a day. Of course, the real thing was I came down from breakfast, and my wife said, "You gotta stop this. You're angry and upset and outraged that we haven't even had breakfast yet." So I went cold turkey. This is a serious addiction, and I'm much better now. But other pathologies are privacy, security, hate speech. So-called fake news is the hot one these days. So this connectivity tends to bring more information than we bargained for. It also brings bad actors, and we're beginning to rely on our networks more and more as the information becomes more valuable. And I believe we're exceeding the resilience of our nets. The nets we're relying on them more rapidly than we're making them resilient. So we build it, and they will come. But who will come? Well, new users will come, new apps will come, bad actors will come. So we need to, we know that now. We've performed that experiment. So connectivity leads to surprises on the upside with content. The information becomes more valuable, and as it becomes more valuable, the bad actors show up in greater numbers. So what have we learned? Well, we have a lot of headroom. There's a lot of connectivity ahead of us. We are not done with connectivity. We're not even halfway there. There are some hints indicating that biomimetics, that is using nature to guide us in the evolution of our connectivity, might pay off. For example, using brain connectivity theory to guide new architectures for our connectivity. Build it and they will come. We're building the next generation network, and new apps will come, new connectivity will come, new bad guys will show up. So we need to add selectivity and defenses and resilience earlier. And then new architecture, packet switching, which is the fundamental architectural technology of the internet, there can be other ones, that is, other architectural advances in how to structure connectivity, and of course, the continued use of standards. So now, ready or not, we have a new internet coming, and it's not the kilobit internet. It's not even the megabit internet that we've been enjoying for the last 10, 15 years. We now have the gigabit internet. And it's not just gigabit, it's augmented. It's going to have AI in it. The internet is already 80 or 90% video. There's going to be more video on the net. We're going to be more mobile. We're going to be operating at much higher speeds, and we're going to be joined on the internet by millions, if not soon billions of things. And here it comes, ready or not. Thank you.
My job is to do the vote of thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank Prof. for gracing this function, and of course doing the opening and allowing us to use WITS hall and the WITS infrastructure and facilities. Thank you very much to the WITS team for that, and their partnership that is enjoyed between South African Institute of Electrical Engineers and WITS in hosting this very important lecture to reflect on some of the stalwarts of South Africa, and as well as showcasing some of the research that's done locally and globally. Of course, the SAIEE team, our CEO, our Chief Operations Officer, and the Secretariat under Khada's guidance, thank you very much. And of course, we'd like to thank our President of the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers, George Debo. It was his idea to bring Prof. Metcalfe down, and he took all the effort to negotiate and contact. And thanks, George, very much for doing that. It was really great. Thank you for that initiative.
So I'd also like to just add my thanks to Bob Metcalfe. Bob arrived on Saturday. We took him on a hike yesterday, and he survived. We took him down the Stadfontein Caves. So he actually said, you do this to all our Bernard Price Memorial lecturers, and how many of them survivors? Well, Bob, thank you. You have survived the first night. This is the start of this is the official lecture, of course. We now take it around the country. But I'd like to, in advance, thank Bob for coming out and being our Bernard Price Memorial lecturer this year. I'd like to thank my own team for the assistance in setting all this up, and finally you, the members of the Institute, for making this lecture. Your attendance is obviously very important. That's what makes the entire lecture. So at this point in time, I'd like to invite you to please join us for refreshments outside, and Bob and I and the rest of the OBs will hang around for a while to talk, and then it's